Welcome to our webinar today. The Alliance was developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and so it's a creation of tools and resources and strategies for families and educators to best serve all learners, as the name implies. And so including just a few of our founding partners here, but we're expanding constantly with new partners joining the Alliance. And so if you do want to participate and again also receive the recording from this, you can definitely check out our website, educatingalllearners.org, to learn more information and to access some of those resources. And so for today, I'll just go ahead and get started, but I did want to introduce you to our three presenters joining us from Unidos US and Diverse Learners Co-op. And so for our first presenter, which is Roxanne Garza, she is the Education Policy Advisor at Unidos US. And prior to joining that team, she was a Senior Policy Analyst with the Education Policy Program at New America, where she provided research and analysis on policies and practices that impacted the teaching quality and school leadership. And also from the Unidos team, we have Ingrid Colon. And before joining their team, she was also a researcher with the Education Policy Program at New America. So they're together, always joining each other's teams. And so for Ingrid, she is a proud immigrant from El Salvador. And as an English learner herself, her research focuses on the experiences of recently arrived immigrant families and their children in public schools. And then our third presenter is Brook from the Diverse Learners Cooperative. And so she leads their efforts to connect teachers and leaders with professional learning, resources, and networks that propel best practice for diverse learners and also increase teacher retention. And so we're really excited to have them join the ELA team today. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll pass it over to Roxanne.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Gabrielle, and thank you for inviting me to join this important webinar today. So as Gabrielle mentioned, I'm with Unidos US, and we were formerly the National Council of La Raza, which is the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. Actively engaging in advocacy to support much needed relief for schools and communities across the country amidst the COVID-19 crisis, particularly for Latinx and English learners. And so our goal is really for all English learners to graduate high school, college, and career ready. And for that to happen, it's critical that ELs do not fall further behind during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we do know that as the reach of COVID-19 has spread, we are seeing increased need for support for English learners that requires additional federal support to help ensure that states and districts have the necessary resources to address the unique needs of English learners. Next slide. So I'll just kick us off here with some fast facts about English learners. So ELs are a large and growing population in our nation's schools, and they need specific support and services for success. We know that about 1 in 10 public school students are English learners, and 77% of ELs are Latino. We also know that nearly 700,000 ELs are dual identified as also having disabilities, and nearly 60% of ELs live in households where income levels are less than 185% of the poverty line. Next slide. Thank you. So despite educators' best efforts during the crisis, it is proving really difficult to provide high quality online instruction for underserved students. We know based on preliminary research by the NWEA, an Oregon-based research nonprofit, it suggests that students nationwide will return to school in the fall with roughly 70% of learning gains in reading relative to a typical school year and less than 50% in math. These gains will likely be even lower for students from low income and rural backgrounds who may not have access to the technological devices, high-speed connectivity, and curricular resources that they need. And for Latino and English learners who were already experiencing academic gaps due to inequities in the system even before the pandemic started. And the reason these stakes are especially high for English learners is really that they are at risk of experiencing loss on two fronts. So without language development help, students' progress towards mastering the English language is slowed, and their ability to pick up subjects taught to them in English slows down as well. Next slide. So we've also done some polling data that really shows that parents are really concerned about their children's academic progress. So in a recent Unidos US poll with Somos and Move On, we learned that 81% of Latino parents are worried that their children are falling behind in school. We also know that among those working and schooling from home, 85% have not received technological or financial support. So this might mean, things like a loaner laptop, hotspots, or help paying for higher internet or cell phone bills. And in a parent poll by the Education Trust, more than a third, so about 38% of non-English home speakers and a quarter of native Spanish speakers say their child's school has not provided materials in other languages in their home languages, which is another big concern that we've been hearing a lot about. So without access to the proper infrastructure to learn and without resources for parents, we're essentially leaving students and families to fend for themselves, knowing that there are vast inequities in the resources that families have at their disposal. So, moving on to what the federal government has done in response to COVID-19. So over the past few months, the federal government has passed laws to help overcome the challenges caused by the pandemic. So as some of you may or may not be familiar, in March, Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which is also known as the CARES Act. This provided $30 billion in formula funding for governors, state education agencies, and institutions of higher education, which are really meant to support schools in mitigating the challenges for students and families during this time. But as we've seen in the past, we know that state budgets will likely be cut. We've already been seeing that. And education will be one of the budget items that will likely be deeply impacted by this pandemic. So we know that more resources are going to be needed to cover the needs of students and schools, especially as districts plan on reopening for the fall and higher education institutions do the same. So now Congress is starting negotiations for what we hope is another COVID-19 relief package. And Democrats in both the House and the Senate have put forward bills with their priorities. So there's still, a long way to whether those bills actually get passed and how things get negotiated, but two bills have been released so far. So in May, the House of Representatives released the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, which is a mouthful. It's also known as the HEROES Act. That included additional education provisions that would help fill some of the gaps left by the CARES Act. And the proposal would add about $100 billion for education, in addition to some other funding for broadband support. So that's what the House Democrats have introduced so far. And last week, the Senate Democrats introduced an education bill, which is the Coronavirus Child Care and Education Relief Act, which would include $345 billion in emergency education funding, and additional $1 billion for Title III, which is the federal funding source that is targeted for English language acquisition programs to support English language learners. So important to note, the CARES Act provided this, large and almost like a block grant that is has a lot of allowable uses, but doesn't target funding for specific students or for specific purposes. And the HEROES Act follows a similar suit, even though it has more money. It's also kind of a broad block grant. So the difference between those two other bills and the recent the Child Care and Education Relief Act is that bill does include targeted funding for specific students and for specific sources. So we were excited to see that Title III was kind of called out for that $1 billion in supplemental funding that we would hope would help English learners and their families really receive the support that they need, because we know that additional resources are needed now to meet the challenges of distance learning for ELs and to prepare for the increased support that we know that they will need in the coming school year, as states and districts, you know, plan on reopening and want to improve their planning and interventions that will be planned for the fall. And really to build capacity to address the learning slide that students, you know, will likely have experienced over the past several months. So that's just some overall context setting for the conversation that we will have that Ingrid and Brooke will talk more about. So now I will just go ahead and pass things off to my colleague, Dr. Ingrid Colon, who will be talking more about guidance for student learning during the remote learning experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. And Gabrielle, if you can just go back to the other slide, please. Thank you so much. Buenos días o buenas tardes a todas, todos, todes. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. And welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Dr. Ingrid Colon. My pronouns are ella, she, and her. I was born and raised in El Salvador. And as all of us, I'm a lifelong language learner. And I'm currently serving as the Education Research Program Manager at Windows US. During my section of this webinar, you will hear and see that I will be translanguaging or using my full linguistic repertoire, which includes some caliche, a language that combines words in Nahuatl and Spanish. Nahuatl is the language of the Pupiles indigenous people of the land of what we now know as El Salvador. I will also be using some Espanol because I'm always using all of my linguistic abilities, which is what we should always do with all of our brilliant students, families, and communities we serve. I want to reiterate that there is a great linguistic diversity that characterizes the population of our students adding the English language to their linguistic repertoire in our schools. However, in this webinar, just like my colleague Roxanne, I will be discussing for this section how we can better serve our Latinx students who also happen to be emergent bilingual or multilingual learners. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is to go over some terms that we use to refer to our students acquiring the English language. So I want to point out that the term English learners, or ELs, has been a designated and protected term used by federal, state, and local educational authorities. Once students receive this label, their English learning needs are identified and funds are allotted to their education. And this term is designated by how our students perform on grade level, content, and what has been decided as academic language and academic English, reflected on the standardized testing, which ignores other parts of our students' languages, language practices, and education. So, although these terms or labels are always evolving and changing in education, it is critical for us to acknowledge, recognize, value, and celebrate all of our students' language practices. Next slide, please. Thus, because we want to recognize our students' linguistic repertoire in our K-12 spaces, in my research and practice as an educator, I use a term that scholars like Doctora Ofelia Garcia and other scholars have been advocating for to refer to our students learning English in our schools, and that is the term emergent bilinguals, or EBs, or even emergent multilinguals, which recognizes that our students' full linguistic abilities are always emerging and developing, and that they have the possibility to become bilingual or multilingual, since a lot of our students already speak more than one language. For example, when I used to teach third grade, I had a student from Guatemala once who spoke Quiché, which is one of the most common indigenous languages in Guatemala, and also spoke Spanish. So my student was on his way to becoming multilingual by learning a third language, which will be English. Our emergent bilingual or emergent multilingual students already come to us with rich linguistic practices and a language repertoire to continue developing their language abilities in what they already know in other languages. Thus, this term does not focus on students learning only the English language. And it is important to note that you don't have to be an educator in a dual language program or a bilingual program to use this term when we serve our students acquiring English. as Dr. Ofelia Garcia shares with us, that English learners are in fact emergent bilingual students. That is, through school and through acquiring English, these students become bilingual, able to continue to function with their home language practices, as well as in English, their new language that they are acquiring in school. So when we ignore the bilingualism or multilingualism that our students have, we end up perpetuating inequities in the education of our students. Next slide, please. Having said that, let's reflect for a moment here. Do we value and find ways for our emergent bilingual students to develop their full linguistic abilities in all of the languages that they already know and expand their linguistic repertoire in our practice? Or do we undermine, put aside, and even subtract their language abilities in order to only becoming proficient in the English language, to perform well in content level academic English language testing? And to quote my amigo and colleague, oh, sorry, Gabriel, stay there. And to quote my amigo and colleague, Dr. Jose Medina, in one of his fabuloso videos in social media, we even call our students learning the English language at risk. So it is important for us to think about the long-term effects of what this can do to our students acquiring the English language. Even in my own journey, learning the English language, when I arrived to this country, being 14 years old and a 9th grader in high school, I struggled learning the English language due to being exposed to an only sink or swim approach. That right away taught me that if I didn't learn of what is considered the standard English language or what is considered the norm in this country, I was not going to graduate and become successful. This approach of assimilation has hurt me significantly and has left me a little pain that I'm still trying to overcome to this day. For example, I have felt that my accent is unintelligible, or that I am inarticulate, or I'm not assertive enough when I speak and write, that my grammar is wrong, that my writing is not clear, that if I take longer to respond or I'm not eloquent enough, it's a reflection of my deficiencies in the English language. After 23 years of being in the United States, I have internalized these feelings, even when people do not directly tell me these things. I still feel them. So I reflect on these long-term effects often and think about how we as educators can disrupt these experiences from continuing to happen to our emergent bilingual students, because they can clearly have lasting effects and irreversible impact in their lives. So I draw from the work of Dr. Rosa and Dr. Flores, who suggest to move away from education practices that respond to our emergent bilingual students' supposed linguistic deficiencies or gaps, to vision of how they can learn to challenge the ways of how their linguistic practices are received and interpreted by others. Next slide, please. Therefore, to better serve our Latinx emergent bilingual students, regardless whether we are teaching through distance learning or not, we must not make assumptions about our Latinx emergent bilingual students and about all of our Latinx students in general. We must remember that our Latinx emergent bilingual students are not a monolithic or homogeneous group. In the past 20 years, many research studies have highlighted the diversity that exists within the emergent bilingual Latinx population. Let's remember, for instance, not all Latinx emergent bilingual students are immigrants or have recently arrived to this country. The great majority of our Latinx emergent bilingual students in our schools are in fact US born. And from the moment they are born, they are exposed to the English language at home and outside of schools. Another aspect to keep in mind is that not all of our Latinx emergent bilingual students are acquiring English. They might even feel more comfortable, in fact, in the English language. Yet, because they are not able to pass a standardized test in grade level academic language, they are still labeled as English learners. Also, we might have emergent bilingual students whose first and home languages are now Spanish. Instead, they speak indigenous languages, or they may be from Brazil, let's say, who speak Portuguese or other languages. Also keeping in mind that although many of our Latinx and emergent bilingual students are in elementary schools, the greatest increase in the number of emergent bilinguals are also in high school. We must also be aware that although many students we serve may have had previous educational experience in schools, We're also going to serve students that have limited or interrupted or what we call formal education, which now has exacerbated even more due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as my colleague Roxanne mentioned. The linguistic identities of Latinx emergent bilingual students is complex. Latinx emergent bilinguals are diverse in terms of social characteristics like race, ethnicity, cultural historical backgrounds, also their ancestral knowledge, multi-identities and language repertoires. Yet many schools in the United States continue to label and teach Latinx emergent bilingual students using teaching practices that do not recognize, support, and embrace their individual and unique backgrounds. Because we need to get to know our Latinx emergent bilingual students and their families individually. Having said that, we must have education spaces in however ways we define those spaces during this pandemic where multilingualism is elevated, acknowledged, celebrated, and valued. And when I talk about multilingualism, I'm talking about all the dynamic linguistic practices that our Latinx emergent bilingual students have, including the languages of the home, regionalismos from different places in Latin America or in the United States. For example, in El Salvador, we say pajillas. In Mexico, we say popotes for straws here in English here in the United States. Also in El Salvador, we say salud to say goodbye. And some people might think that that is not appropriate Spanish, but we use it in our language. Therefore, it is as authentic and legitimate. Also, we need to embrace the language practices that our students use in the playground with their amigas, amigos, amigues, the language they use in the cafeteria when they're hanging out with their friends, the language from the música our students are listening to, the TikTok videos they are actually watching or creating. All of their language practice repertoires represent their whole selves and ways of being. So we must respect that. Next slide, please. Now, we must understand that learning a language is a difficult process, let me tell you. Especially when the linguistic abilities and practice that our Latinx students bring to schools are often perceived as not academic, the standard or the norm of what we assess. Therefore, we must remember that learning a language takes a lot of time. That means we need to have a clear understanding about the process and remind ourselves about what research tells us in regard to the amount of time that takes to develop what testing defines as proficiency in an additional language, which takes 5 to 7 years for this process. So it takes a long time. Even for me, after 23 years of working to add the English language to my linguistic repertoire, I still feel as an emergent bilingual student myself. I'm always working towards developing and expanding my linguistic practices. For example, for me, receptive language or the abilities to listen and read in the English language was easier for me to learn. However, expressive language, which includes the ability to speak and write, took me way longer. I'm still working on my expressive language development, by the way, in the English language every day, learning new words, etc. Next slide, please. Now, keeping in mind that we're going through an uncertain time and fluid situation, for some of us, we already received the news that we will be back to our schools this fall. And for some of us, we still don't know, right? Nonetheless, we understand that although distance learning is far from perfect, especially when we are dealing with crisis, emergency distance learning, it is something that we just need to be ready for. Thus, at Unidos US, we have shared with our affiliates serving Latinx emergent bilingual students across the nation and in different contexts to be adaptive, to be flexible, and to not take these practices as one size fits all approach, or that they must work within each of our contexts. So here's just some distance learning practices to consider and that we have learned from some of our affiliates themselves and research. Next slide, please. Primero lo primero, first things first. A successful distance learning experience for our emergent bilingual students and families will strive to embed practices and routines that must promote the overall mental and emotional health of you. Yes, you, nosotros as the educators. And we must recognize that. So just like that, we need that we also must focus on our emergent bilingual students' mental, social, emotional well-being and physical needs before moving on to program curricular goals. This is very important. Many of our Latinx emergent bilingual students are experiencing the loss of a member of their families due to COVID-19. Their families or caregivers might be currently sick, or many have lost their jobs. They may be dealing with home evictions. They may need food, may be separated from their families. There are just so many things going on right now. So we need to model empathy, flexibility, critical and creative thinking, and thoughtful responsiveness to ensure that emergent bilingual students continue to grow personally, linguistically, and academically. And remind ourselves that we are all adjusting to distance learning education, and this is an uncertain and fluid situation. Next slide, please. We also need to build strong and collaborative relationships with family, caregivers, and your emergent bilingual students. Our Latinx families are important members of our learning community rather than a challenge to overcome. We need to strive for our Latinx families to be treated equitably and they're part of our learning comunidad. We must recognize their leadership, their potential to offer opportunities by a collaborative and welcoming environments in these virtual spaces where our families can feel involved in making the decisions and lead in initiatives even during distance learning, regardless of their dominance of the English language or the cultural backgrounds. Just because the families we serve speak languages other than English, that should not be the reason why they're not participating in our school's leadership positions or virtual learning spaces. We can find translation and interpretation services or invite other parents or school personnel to collaborate. We can build these collaborative relationships by using creative ways to communicate, by using WhatsApp, by using Facebook, or other popular technology tools that our families are used to in their languages that they feel comfortable with. So we must establish collaborative and consistent communication with students, with our students and familias or their caregivers in their home languages to ensure that distance learning curriculum assignments and other updates, they are pretty much understanding, everything of the process that we're going through in this situation. For example, also we need to know that our families have specific needs, right? And we need to ask them what they need because every situation is different. So, for example, my colleague Roxanne shared that with us, many of our families, our students are still in need of devices such as laptops, tablets, and phones. And also some of our familias have multiple children and live in multi-generational households with extended family members, all trying to use a single device. So it's very different and they're very difficult for every situation. And internet also, phone access, electricity even might be an issue in as having a stable home. So assuring that translation services are accurate and cultural and linguistically accurate and responsive to our familias is absolutely important and critical. Next slide, please. Here is also another wonderful recommendations. Get to know your students, get to know your emergent bilingual students, their brilliance, their lived experience, all of the language practices, home languages, and strengths of families in the community to leverage these powerful sources of learning that integrate the domains of language development, the listening, speaking, reading, writing, cross-linguistic connections. And so we can get to that curricular goals. Also, when we are choosing activities for our students to engage in distance learning education, we must not assume that all of our students have all the tools they need or the support to complete these activities. But also we must stop assuming that they don't. This is why it's important to get to know your students individually. They will tell you what they are interested in learning and also what they need to make this happen. So elevate their voices and brilliance through shared decision-making and authentic choices, honoring their experiences and valuing their contributions to group discussions are critical to elevate their voices. Our emergent bilingual students must be respected. Our older emergent bilingual students especially can be sensitive to group activities that make them feel disrespected. So adapt content and activities so they can express themselves, to take action, to improve outcomes of the community about topics that they care about, and challenge systemic and structural barriers. And by incorporating their voices and choices, we must also provide them flexibility and support to maximize their learning. Next slide, please. Also allow emerging bilingual students to share their life experiences and lenses that affect their perception of the world, to their learning, and to learn how to make connections among each other. Provide activities that inspire them to solve problems or improve aspects of their day-to-day life. They have so much power. We just need to help them elevate that voice. Again, learn from the brilliance of your students. Next slide, please. And of course, provide high quality learning resources in participants' home languages, as well as virtual tutoring and coaching where needed. Reach out to your school administrators and colleagues for collaborative support in getting these services. Include enough time for participants to understand and function of the engagement platforms. That takes a lot of time. So it's very important that we do that, and they understand how to navigate these tools before we go into the curriculum. Use instructional strategies where they maintain their engagement, physical response, visual graphics, organizers, among other practices that you know that have worked in the past. And provide additional time and opportunities for emergent bilingual students to complete assignments in their home languages. This is very important. Give them choices, how they feel comfortable, because the idea for them is to be growing in every way, not just in the English language. Next slide, please. So here are some libros that inspire me and inform my work. I highly recommend you these 5 wonderful books. The first one is Cultural Sustained Pedagogies from Dr. Django Perez and Dr. Alim. Fantastic resource. En Comunidad for wonderful professors and scholars, Dr. España and Dr. Herrera. Educating Emergent Bilinguals. Also, a lot of the policy lenses in this book from Dr. Rafael Garcia and colleague. And the Translanguaging Classroom, fantastic resource to incorporate all the linguistic repertoires and abilities of our students in the classroom from Dr. Rafael Garcia as well. And Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race is a highly recommended book from Dr. Jonathan Rosa. Next slide, please. Here's some references of the articles that I have used, the resources that I have used to inform my work that I really would like to share with you, so you can go back and make references of this information. Next slide, please. And as we see in these bellos cipotes, beautiful students, I will leave you with this. Of course, it is our goal to help our Latinx emergent bilingual students grow academically. But we must first consider and address the systemic and structural barriers that many of our students experience and that continue underserving them. We must stop blaming our Latinx emergent bilingual students and language practices as the reason why they're not succeeding in our schools. These are only deficit perspectives that exacerbate racial inequities in our schools. La lucha continúa. The fight continues. Muchas gracias. And now I'm going to pass it on to my wonderful colleague, Brook Allen, who will talk about our dual identified learners.
Great. Well, I am so grateful for your perspective, Ingrid, and all that you both bring to this work. I'm Brook Allen. I'm the director of the Diverse Learners Cooperative. The DLC is a nonprofit organization that connects teachers and leaders with professional learning resources and networks to propel best practice for diverse learners. And we specifically focus on increasing teacher retention, as this is a huge barrier in what our diverse learners have access to in terms of quality education. So I'm going to build off a lot of the ideas that Ingrid and Roxanne have shared, but I love to focus specifically on dual identified learners and defining these learners as those that are entitled to receive both specialized support for English language acquisition, as well as specific supports for their learning needs due to a disability. So today we're going to cover 3 questions. What does the law say about dual identified learners in identifying and serving them? And then in practice, what do we know about identifying dual what do we know about identifying language learners with disabilities? And what do we know about serving dual identified learners during this global health crisis? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the primary law that protects the rights of students with disabilities. It has the provisions of a free and appropriate public education and access to learning and support in the student's least restrictive environment. IDEA lays out a process for finding children who may qualify for these supports, including an evaluation process that must be given in home languages. From this process, students who are found eligible receive supports through their individualized education plan or their IEP. And then IDEA makes clear that families should have access to translated materials and interpretation services for all meetings and communication, though we know that that sometimes is a gap in our service. Within the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, Title I and Title III have specific provisions for English learners. These provisions hold schools accountable to demonstrating EL achievement and growth. And additionally, these mandates lay out a process for identifying ELs through a survey and assessment process, and then ELs are served through their individualized learning plans, or ILPs. So the processes are, through the law, the way it lays it out, sound very familiar. They're similar processes, which can actually make it somewhat confusing and complicated. What we do know about the intersection of these two laws is this. One is they are chronically underfunded, as are many things, but these in particular. And then second, that they're not a substitute for each other. One is not prioritized over the other. When an EL is identified with a disability, they must have access to both specialized learning support services and specialized learning services. It is a both and, not an either or. So the combination of little funding and then also doubly supporting students as they should be means that we have to get really creative with the solutions that we come up with. So let's talk a bit more about identifying ELs. What do we know about how students are identified? So consider this, if the data holds true within subgroups, 13% of our US student population is eligible for disability services within one of IDEA's 13 disability categories. This is likely true of ELs as well. Through identification challenges, though, it means that ELs are often underrepresented in special education. Disabilities represented within the EL student population are very statistically aligned with the broader population. Specific learning disabilities and speech and language impairments are the most prevalent within this group as well. Accurate and reliable identification are not uncomplicated. Several features of language learning mimic some characteristics of disability, but they are not one and the same. We need to find ways to parse the two when possible and identify root cause so that we can align the best instructional approach. It will always require a student-by-student approach. On the next slide, in this time of distance learning, this becomes even further complicated. We have compounding factors of learning loss and potentially limited access to English over the last many months. And as we move into new grade levels and new teaching teams, teachers will not have the relationships with students right away, and it will be difficult to separate challenges of language versus of disability. What we can do, though, is stay as close to the need as possible. We need to know, as Ingrid said, we need to know our students. We need to provide them frequent and varied opportunities for them to read and write and listen and speak. That will not only serve them instructionally, but it will provide us access to continued information on how they're progressing toward their learning and their language goals in order to identify what their needs are. So what can we do with that? I'm going to go over several strategies around serving ELs with disabilities. So first is that we communicate with families early and often. Families truly hold the key to understanding our students. Find ways to authentically connect with families on their terms, in their familiar language, and through familiar modes. This could be phone calls, text messages, emails, using an app like WhatsApp. Find out what works for them, and then establish a plan from the beginning to engage families in the IEP team process. The IEP can be a complicated process. An annual IEP meeting is required, but reach out to families long before this meeting. It is truly a process, and amplifying their voices within the team will go so much further toward ensuring student needs are reflected in the document itself. And then communicate progress frequently, ask for input, and regularly reflect on ways that families contribute to their students' experience of school. The DLC has several tools for making a plan to communicate via our reentry roadmap site, and they'll be linked here when you have access to the slides, but you can see a couple of pictures on this side. Next, a dual identified student is going to have a lot of teachers and team members in his or her corner. We have EL teachers, we have special ed teachers, we have core content teachers, related service providers, instructional coaches. There are so many people, which is great, but we have to ensure that team members are on the same page. They need time to coordinate and develop a balanced schedule for support. Leverage the expertise of the team to provide service and support each other, and then provide both families and students with access to the learning schedule, especially as we move into continued seasons of remote learning. We need to communicate with each other and with families what the plan is, and then come back to reflect on it often. This could take the form of a weekly overview for families in their home language, or a visual schedule for students. Schedule time to meet frequently as a team to share progress and develop strategies to tackle these new challenges. Next, prioritize access to their peers for dual identified learners. Incorporate consistent time for developing social and emotional skills alongside their classmates through community building activities like lunch bunch or circle or morning meeting. Lots of options there. This is particularly important for students with disabilities, as they need a time to build positive peer relationships and access models and tools for self-regulation. This time is full of so much unknown, which can be particularly scary for all of our students and us too. We need to be very explicit about this uncertainty and what we can do together to get through that. So provide support for those interactions. What should they look like, sound like, feel like? What forms can they take, and how can we support students to get the most out of this time? We need to think beyond providing a translated assignment as the main means of accessibility. Instead, designing lessons that bake in access points from the start. Use the principles of universal design for learning to support this process. UDL challenges us to provide multiple ways for students to access learning, express their learning, and engage in the process of learning. There are a myriad of strategies that can apply within each one of these aspects. They will be necessary for some students, but truly will be beneficial for all of our students and create a more inclusive opportunity. This is what the law means by free and appropriate. Lesson access is more than just logging on to Zoom. It is more than a packet or a worksheet. It is real engagement and appropriately ambitious instruction for helping students to meet their goals. So here's a very, very simple example of one way to begin the lesson design process with accessibility in mind. The key here is to increase opportunities and increase the variety of those opportunities. Then we provide frequent and targeted feedback that builds on student knowledge. For example, we have an assignment in English. There may be barriers like limited literacy in their first language, or access to English vocabulary may be difficult because of background knowledge having different funds of knowledge, right, or not aligned with the current assignment. So can we provide it in a home language, but more than that? Can we pair it with visuals? Can we listen to the audio recording? When we think about response, can we record it, audio record a response? Can we write the response, create the response? Whatever that looks like, to provide multiple ways to access and engage in that material. Language learners who have learning challenges may need to develop insight into the way ideas work together. So help them to see or hear that structure. If asked to write a paragraph, that task can be really overwhelming. Given a graphic organizer, especially a visual one, they can see the structure. Use paired cognates or visuals to see and hear how ideas are connected. Use lined or highlighted paper or help parents to see this as a strategy to give structure to a response. Make behavioral expectations clear ahead of time and provide an advanced organizer or an agenda for the class, especially if it's via video conference. And practice a structure for responding to emotions and impulses. These structures and processes may be less visible without explicit directions and frequent reminders for some of our learners. So on the outset, think about how to make the structure visible for our students. Through this time of distance learning, anticipate that new needs are going to surface. Social, emotional, behavioral, and other mental health needs are assuredly present for all of us. The intersections of difficulties families are experiencing in this time is untold, and we must be vigilant to observe and support our students. Ask the right questions, ask them frequently. Instead of "how are you doing?" ask families to narrate their experience and be ready to listen. And then be responsive. Connect families with the support that they need. Be aware of community-based organizations that will provide support in the family's home language and be responsive to their needs. Collaborate with your school counselor. Rely on other school personnel. Call in help when it goes beyond your capacity to serve well. And then follow up often to ensure that support is being successful. Finally, my challenge before was to get creative. With little additional funding and the need to shift our services, we must think outside the box, identifying additional resources or opportunities that exist. Leverage funds of knowledge and family practices to integrate learning at home. Are there peer mentors or alternative grouping strategies that can be employed? How about bilingual classes that are offered across schools, as location is less of a barrier in the virtual space? Finally, are there community partnerships that you can call in to support this work? There's certainly a learning curve in developing new and purposeful solutions, but it doesn't make the learning and gap closing any less urgent. Those are my strategies for dual identified learners, and we have a bunch more resources, and I'll link them here too in the presentation at our specific to reentry site called the DLC Resource Center. Our emails are here too, and I think Gabrielle is going to talk more about that.
Absolutely. So we do have a few minutes. If any of you had any questions, you're welcome to add them to the chat now. But we did want to add, obviously Brooke, Ingrid, and Roxanne's contact information here on the screen because we know that we are running short on time. So you're absolutely welcome to reach out for them. Again, for more resources, we have linked a few here that were mentioned. As well as their emails. So you're absolutely welcome to reach out. And I do believe there was one question in the chat we might have some time to get to. I believe it was for the Unidos US team. And so one person was asking if groups like Unidos are advocating for changing the federal definition to emergent bilingual or emergent multilingual students.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much for that question. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Well, so this actually is a term that I particularly use in my own research and my own work as an educator. And I don't know any groups advocating for changing this term yet. I actually shared this term with my colleague Amalia from our policy team, just to start thinking about these terms that are becoming very popular and just getting a lot of traction in the field of our education. So just engaging in these discussions at this moment, just a preliminary discussions as a team. But also I'm very excited to maybe start researching on other organizations that are advocating for this term too. Thank you, Hannah, for that question, and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. And I think a few of the other questions were already answered in the chat. So definitely refer there if you had similar questions. There are also some links provided. But again, I did want to remind everyone that we will be sharing these slides, so you'll be able to go over the information again, and there will be links added so you can click through. And of course, the recording will also be made available online so you can watch it and keep learning. So you're absolutely welcome to share it with your colleagues and your team. And from the ELA team, we wanted to thank our presenters again from the Unidos US and Diverse Learners Cooperative teams for joining us. And hopefully you look into them more, find out more information, contact them, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going. But thank you again, everybody. I believe that concludes our time for today, and I hope you have a good rest of your days.